Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of After Action Reports. My name is Josh Joshi Howard, and today we're going to be talking about the Mugu Games 40K Store Championship I went to this last weekend. Normally, this is where I would be taking the time to thank all the people who are running the event for the hard work that they have done and talk about all of the appreciation I generally have for the community in general. However, this is going to be a little bit of a different opening. I'm going to start off by saying that there were a couple of good things about this event. Namely, it had really good prize support and it was being streamed by a local member of the community. If you are interested in checking out more of it, D6 Tabletop, I'll throw a link down to it down in the description. Hello, Andrew. I do appreciate the work that you do. However, I'm going to follow it up with some other issues that I have had with this event in particular. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. I've already told a lot of the people in the local community in the Pacific Northwest some of the issues with what I have seen at the event, as well as some other issues with local players. So the people who need to know that information already have it. What I will say is I don't think this event was particularly well run. I think there are several business practices of the store that are not very useful for the community in general, and there were a lot of bad actors in the player population at this event. Some of them I saw firsthand, some of them I heard from other people who I respect and believe. And with all that in mind, I'm going to sum this up by saying I didn't have the best time at this event, and I will not be returning to the store in the future. There's a little more detail in my Discord if you're already a part of it, but I don't want my channel to be really focused on the drama, and while I am very much in favor of pushing bad actors out of the community, I've already given the local community the information that they need to make that decision. I was very unsure whether or not I wanted to make this video at all, but a lot of the people in the community have pushed that they are still interested in me talking about the games, me talking about my list, me talking about what I actually did at this event that led to the success that I had. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start getting into the actual event. The list that I brought to this event is very stock standard. There's not a lot of really unique things happening in this. It is basically a very normal guard list that we've been seeing for a long time, especially on Games Workshop terrain. We have one Cadian command squad, Gaunt's Ghost, two Rogal commanders identically fitted out with multi-meltas and heavy stubbers, Sly Marbo, and Ursula Creed. Sly Marbo is perhaps the most interesting part of this list. I put him in the list because of the player pack, knowing in advance that every single mission was going to be either on Games Workshop Layout 1 or Games Workshop Layout 4, meaning that every single objective is incredibly difficult to stand on because it is almost entirely exposed to shooting. So having that one extra relatively cheap blown-up character to run around gives me a little bit more freedom to actually stand on these objectives in ways that might come up, especially if I'm going first. And then our last character was, of course, Ursula Creed. We had one unit of 20 Cadian shock troops, one unit of 20 Death Corps of Krieg, the Cadian shock troops, of course, being attached to Ursula Creed and the Cadian command squad, 3 Chimeras, all with heavy flamers, 3 units of Kasrkin, 1 Leman Exterminator with multi-meltas, and then 2 Scout Sentinels with las cannons. The big theory behind this list is the same as a lot of guard lists that you've seen in the past. We have the 20-man unit of Death Corps of Krieg to go stand on our natural. We have a 20-man unit of Cadian shock troops. This does a couple of things. One, in almost every game, they are very good at moving out into the middle of the board on turns 3, 4, and 5 in order to put a lot of OC, a lot of bodies in the middle later after it is harder to kill this unit. And also, it has enough bodies that you can put out a tendril to go touch the middle objective or sometimes your natural in order to sticky it, potentially going on turn 1 so that we become sticky on turn 2 if your opponent has to put out something in order to try and deal with that unit that won't be able to kill it. You can just kill off the tendril and then you will be either very difficult to charge or you're just going to remain having most of the command bricks still hanging out on your home objective no matter what. It gives you a lot of freedom if you go first in particular to push armies that can't really deal with big units of individual wounds. Then it's followed up with 3 units of Chimera with Kasrkin inside, and these are just crazy strong brawling units. They're going to be able to kill like light vehicles. They're going to be really good at dealing with like small marine units. And the 2 heavy flamers in every Chimera does mean that you actually have a pretty decent output. Like, you just kill chaff really effectively because you have 18 shots of nonsense and then 2 heavy flamers. So it gives Guard a really strong skirmishing core that is going to play for the middle objective and play for your opponent's natural very aggressively. And then we followed up, of course, with the 2 Scout Sentinels, the Leman Exterminator, and the 2 Rogal battle tanks, so you have sufficient firepower to really go toe-to-toe with almost anything in the game. I chose to go with this style of list because it is good. It doesn't really have any bad matchups. The hardest things are like a couple of like infiltrate jails probably. And even then, I have Gaunt's Ghost and Sly Marbo that I can use to block out the worst part of the infiltrate jails. Overall, I was very happy with the list. The big thing that I would look to change depending on what you're playing on, I think Sly Marbo is something that could have very easily been another Scout Sentinel. I think Sly Marbo probably could have been another Scout Sentinel. And then after that, you could probably fiddle with points a little bit if you wanted to try and change a Chimera to a Torox, or if you wanted to have a little bit more brawling power by having a couple like Cadian units or something. But otherwise, I think this core makes a lot of sense, and if you're interested in playing on Games Workshop terrain, this should work on basically every Games Workshop terrain format you have. So let's go ahead and get into the games themselves. For the first game, I was playing up against another guy named Josh, and he was playing Tyranids Subterranean Assault. He was playing the Swarmlord, a unit of hyper-adapted Raveners, 1 unit of 10 Gargoyles, a Biovore, 2 Lictors, 1 unit of 5 Raveners, 1 Exterminator, 2 Norn Emissaries, a Trigon with a Trigon Prime. I think this is an enhancement, and then 2 Tyrannofexes with Rupture Cannons. Josh and I were playing this on Mission G, Purge the Foe, Hammer and Anvil on Games Workshop Layout 1. Now, a couple of really big things about this matchup to think about is, one, I think it is pretty darn guard favored. I think it is generally fairly difficult for guard to lose the Subterranean Assault matchup for a couple of reasons. The first one being Tyranids don't really have consistent firepower in being able to kill our tanks. Yes, they can get lucky and one-shot a Dorn with a Tyrannofex, but that's really unlikely, especially if you pop smoke and suddenly the Tyrannofex is hitting on 4s most of the time. And then everything else is really going to struggle to really do damage to toughness 11 or toughness 12 and 2-up saves. Like the Exterminator is generally going to do 3, maybe 6 damage, and everything else relies on being in melee, at which point we can screen them out very effectively. That's the other part, is Subterranean Assault relies very heavily on having all of these tools in order to get into favorable engagements, but because their first thing that they deep strike in still has to come 9 inches away, it's really easy for guard to screen out the 9-inch thing first, and then even though they come in 6 inches after that, it's really easy for us to prevent Tyranids from charging into our tanks. It's really easy for us to prevent them from charging into our vehicles. And so if they're spending like their Trigon Prime charging into a unit of Kasrkin, cool, we don't care. We are now going to kill the Trigon immediately afterwards. Now, the deployment on Layout 1 for this style of list is pretty straightforward as well. Most of the time, on any deployment where the objective ends up being up here somewhere, like it might be like touching here, it might be a little bit further back, wherever it is, in general, you're going to put a unit of Death Korps of Krieg in this terrain piece with the idea that it's going to come touch the No Man's Land objective on turn 1. However, the fact that it is Hammer and Anvil, this is one of the few times on Layout 1 where you don't do that. Instead, the Death Korps of Krieg is going to come out over here, and their main job is to stand on this objective instead. The big reason for this is the staging points on Layout 1, like over here and here, are relatively easy for us to draw line of sight on or to control by having our Rogal Dorn standing right over here. Whereas if we have a Rogal Dorn trying to protect the objective over here, this Rogal Dorn is going to be really exposed, which makes it very difficult for us to have this Rogal Dorn just in the open, because if our opponent can get like 2 Tyrannofexes like over here just taking shots over this way, it becomes a lot more difficult for us to control the objective. The rest of the army, so we have like Rogal Dorn, you start a Chimera in front of it, and then your other 2 Chimeras are generally going to start somewhere in here with the idea that if you go second, they're going to scout into this pocket and stage there for later. And if you go first, they're just going to go out this way in order to control a lot of space. Ursula Creed and friends, depending on the matchup, are either going to be strung out basically like this and cover your entire backfield, or you might have a tendril starting like 2 guys here, a big clump of guys here, and then you can come touch the middle objective and try to stick you on turn 1 if your opponent doesn't have the firepower or the melee necessary to actually kill the 26-man unit. And then, of course, your last Dorn is just going to start over here. One of the big things about Layout 1, if you've never played it, is the Rogal Dorn is like 5 1/8 inches thick, and this right here is 5 inches wide, so you do have to check every single time, depending on what terrain you're playing with, on whether or not the Dorn actually fits through this corridor. It is going to be inconsistent depending on what terrain you're actually playing on. And then the Leman Russ Exterminator on Games Workshop Layout 1 is basically always going to hang out here with the idea that this gap should always or nearly always be wide enough for a Leman Russ to go through, and then you can poke it out here. It's going to help control here and this firing lane. With this game being Purge the Foe, a mission that is very go second favored for 2 reasons. One, if you are going second, you know how many units you need to kill in the battle round on your turn in order to make sure you get kill more, or to at least deny your opponent kill more. And also the near certainty that you have, as long as you still have an army standing at the end of the game in order to stand on more objectives than your opponent did in the bottom of 4, generally means that going second is a nearly guaranteed 16 on primary, whereas the person going first is generally looking for ways to break that. If both players just get hold 1, kill 1, but never getting hold more, kill more on any turn except the last one, it's going to be about an 8-point primary advantage for the player going second. So the player going first tends to need to be rather aggressive in order to create a lot of opportunities to either hold more or kill more. My win this game mostly came down to the fact that my opponent undercommitted resources in order to try and affect some of the things that he was trying to do. For his 2 Norns, he had one of them end up coming out over here, and one of them took a charge on bottom of 1 over here in order to try and kill Sly Marbo. Now, Norns are a pretty big problem for a lot of armies, but Guard isn't really one of them. Guard actually just has the firepower to take down Norns pretty reliably. And I was able to kill this one on turn 2 and this one on turn 3 pretty handily by taking like one Norn here, coming out, shooting here, taking a minimum angle here, such that I was not shootable on this firing line back, because the Norn had come just past the corner of this terrain piece, so I was able to take that minimum line, and I was able to just take both Dorns and kill the Norn over here without really taking a lot of crackback. Later, when I was trying to kill this Norn by bringing out the Leman Russ that was hanging out here in order to shoot it, we saw one of the major issues that my opponent really had when he started shooting his Tyrannofexes at my Leman Russes and at my Rogal Dorns. And namely, it's that one Tyrannofex is really unlikely to actually even kill a Leman Russ. We're about to do some math. The big thing here is if the Tyrannofex has to move, so they're hitting on 4s, and you pop smoke, so they're hitting on 4s, reroll 1s, you need both Rupture Cannon shots to go through in order to have a chance to kill a Leman Russ, because they max out on 12 damage per shot, and a Leman Russ has 13 wounds. The odds of getting both shots to even hit is only about 34%. We know this because it's just 7/12 for each shot, and you just multiply this by 7/12 because each die roll is independent, and this is going to pop out about 34%. Then you need to get both of them to wound, which we do the same thing. We then multiply all of this by 2/3 times 2/3 because they're wounding on 3s. 2/3 times 2/3 is 4/9, which comes out to the fact that you're only going to get both of them to wound about 15% of the time. Then the weapon is AP4, and if you pop smoke, you're going to have cover, which means that we save 1/3 of the time. So we actually flip this one, so 2/3 times 2/3 for a successful going through a save. Again, we multiply this by 4/9. And even getting 2 Rupture Cannon shots through only happens about 3.8, or we'll just call it 4% of the time. So the odds of a Tyrannofex killing a Leman Russ through smoke is really low. It's only going to happen about once every 25 games. Maybe a little bit higher because you do have like the other little gun, but that's usually going to be shooting at Kasrkin or something. And I don't think my opponent had really internalized this math on how unlikely it is that a Tyrannofex is actually going to be to kill a Leman Russ. Because when I had a Leman Russ here and a Rogal Dorn that had to come out a little bit later over here, my opponent took a Tyrannofex, poked his gun out here, shot here, and they had another Tyrannofex, like over here, shoot this Rogal Dorn. And very unsurprisingly to me, they both lived. And from that point, I just took, like, Rogal Dorn, shoved it, and with Norn dead, and me about to charge my Rogal Dorn into the Tyrannofex, and charge Krieg into the Tyrannofex, suddenly he's just never going to kill my army again. So by undercommitting resources to actually try and kill all of my tanks, my opponent just left me in a position where I was playing with way more army than I was supposed to. So for any Tyranid players out there who's trying to play up against Guard, if you are trying to like take down Guard tanks, what you should generally be doing is you should be taking both of the Tyrannofexes and putting them together, right? If both of these Tyrannofexes are shooting at a Dorn, your odds of actually killing it are a lot better. And one of the other big things is if you have like 3 of them who are hanging out as a group, it's really hard for the Guard player to challenge this, for the same reason it's hard for someone to challenge 3 Vanquishers. Even just killing one is relatively hard. You're going to take a lot of your army in order to actually try and kill one Tyrannofex. And then, if they do kill it, cool. They're now going to be taking 2 Tyrannofexes who are now hitting on 2s rerolling 1s, instead of 3s rerolling 1s, and still 3s rerolling 1s if you are going up against targets that have smoked. And 2 Tyrannofixes are way more likely to kill some of these really big, very durable tanks that your opponents are going to be trying to put up. But you need the Tyrannofixes to be moving kind of as a pack to actually have like real threats against all of these tanks. And when my opponent didn't do that, it meant that I was able to just shove my entire army at him really effectively. And because of that, as my opponent started running out of army on turns 4 and 5, I was able to kill more and hold more in places where I probably shouldn't have been because my opponent was undercommitting into my army. And because of that, I ended up winning this one pretty handily, 98 to 63. For my next game, I ended up playing up against Michael and his Dark Angels. And he was playing a very interesting list because it was an Iron Storm Dark Angels list. He had Azrael, 3 Tech Marines, all with the good Iron Storm enhancements, 1 unit of Assault Intercessors, 1 unit of Normal Intercessors, a unit of JPIs, 1 unit of Scouts, 1 Invader ATV, 1 Brutalis Dreadnought, 2 Land Speeder Vengeances, 1 Raven Ring Dark Shroud, the one that gives you like the smoke aura of stealth and cover, 2 Redemptor Dreadnoughts, 1 Repulsor Executioner, and 1 Storm Speeder Thunderstrike. Land Speeder Vengeances are a little bit unusual. They basically just have a lot of plasma shots, and also if you kill something in shooting that is next to Land Speeder gets to shoot you back. And the Storm Speeder Thunderstrike gives you +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles. So in theory, there's an army that is relatively difficult to kill. If you don't kill it in one go, they can shoot you back with the Iron Storm ability. If you do kill the thing and it's next to a Land Speeder Vengeance, they also get to shoot you back in your own turn. The Redemptor Dreadnoughts are -1 to damage, and their Repulsor Executioner just does a ton. It's going to be having +1 to hit from the Tech Marine. It's also going to be having lethal hits, very likely, and you can give it access to advance and shoot or fall back and shoot. But the major weakness of this army is that it doesn't actually play for the midboard very well. It doesn't have a lot of like throwaway units. You have like an Assault Intercessor unit that's relatively slow. You have an Intercessor squad that is also kind of slow. You have 1 unit of JPIs and you have 1 Scout squad, and then like a Invader ATV. But none of this is durable. None of this really is going to be punching up into a lot of the guard things. And if they're ever in a position where Kasrkin can get to them, the Kasrkin are just going to kill them. This ended up being a really big deal because Michael and I ended up playing this one on Hidden Supplies Crucible Battle, once again on layout 1. With the objectives pushed back into the big L's in the middle of the board, one of the important things to know is that there was overhang over here towards the center, so there were ways to stand on this objective while being basically on this side of the wall as opposed to having to step into the ruin. One of the major advantages I had in this game was the fact that Death Korps of Krieg, if I have like 1 or 2 guys standing here and then the rest of them just hiding over here in cover, basically the only thing in Michael's army that can one-tap this unit is going to be a Repulsor Executioner. And if he brings out his Repulsor Executioner like starting over here and comes out like over here, the Repulsor Executioner is going to immediately die. And with it, a ton of ability for him to fight the rest of my army afterwards is going to be gone. So you could trade a Repulsor Executioner for my 20 Brick of Krieg, but 1, the 20 Brick of Krieg might come back anyway, and 2, it's going to severely cripple his ability to actually deal with my Dorns later in the game. That's not a good trade. Another major advantage was that I could put a Chimera like right here, and then it could move through here, touch this objective, and then put guys right in this pocket. So if Michael didn't have anything in this pocket here that was preventing me from disembarking in that spot, it was very easy for me to just shoot into his staging point, where it was relatively difficult for my opponent to have the movement necessary to get to my staging point. With all the pretty normal deployment stuff that I was talking about, with like the Krieg coming here, Chimera 1 going here, I actually put 1 Chimera over here. This guy ended up kind of not contributing very much to the game, because I think he was offsides. I think he was actually supposed to be like right here, and I put the Dorn even further behind. So this guy is probably supposed to be here. And then the other Chimera, I actually put like over here with the idea that he could either scout backwards into relative safety if I went second, or I could use him to scout forward if I go first. And I ended up going first on this one, which on Hidden Supplies is like a mixed blessing. On the one hand, because it is very easy at the end of the game to stand on 2 objectives and more than your opponent at the end if you still have an army, it's not hard for the person going second to get a 15. However, one of the difficulties that can come when you are severely outclassed in the ability to just play the midboard with relatively cheap nonsense, you're going to be losing a lot of primary relatively early on. And this game was more or less determined by my ability to deal with my opponent's primary super aggressively. I was really worried this game, actually, because on turn 1, I ended up drawing Marked for Death, No Prisoners, and then I redrew one of these into Bring It Down, which meant that not only was I drawing 3 cards that are relatively good to score on turns 2, 3, and onwards, but also that I was getting no points on secondaries going first. Luckily for me, Michael also bricked his turn 1 draws, so that ended up shaking out. But my entire advantage in this game came from the fact that I was so much better at holding primary than my opponent was because I was going first. By putting a unit of Death Korps of Krieg somewhere in here, I think it started off stringing like this, and then later started stringing like this. There was never really an opportunity for Michael to deal with this Death Korps of Krieg unit. He just didn't have the volume to do it. Especially since his Repulsor Executioner was over here, it didn't have the movement really to come out over this way, and if it came out this way, it just wasn't going to have an angle to shoot at all into Death Korps of Krieg. So I was going to be scoring this one basically every turn, and then the next thing that I had to make sure is trying to score this one every turn. And I did this generally by having a mixture of things. One, it was sometimes a Chimera. Later on, I think it was a Dorn that was standing on this objective. But I had ways to stop Michael from scoring primary super heavily throughout the rest of the game. Just like I was talking about, the Chimera that was here, so the way that I did it on turn 2 is by having a Chimera like staged over here, and Michael unwilling to take, like, I think it was a Landspeeder Vengeance over here to try and shoot at it because he did not want to take the trade into the Rogal Dorn coming out and just killing it back. This Chimera was able to stop both this objective and this objective on 2. And I did that by just taking the Chimera, dropping it over here to tie or beat the number of Scout Marines I had on the objective, but also to just embark guys onto this objective. So I stopped this one with Kasrkin and this one with Chimera. And I also like chucked a bomb into like the Dark Shroud thing that was over here, and I did like 5 mortal wounds to it. And I also killed one of the Tech Marines. Then the way that I did it on turn 3, I only held them to 1 because I had the Chimera that was hanging out over here. It came, just as we talked about, stood on this objective here, dropped a bunch of Kasrkin out here. I actually killed the Dark Shroud thing with just like Meltamines through the course of this game. But I stopped him from holding this objective, and I only let him hold this one on turn 3. Then, with Kasrkin, that had died and I had reinforced, I was able to get a unit of Kasrkin to rapid ingress back here because my opponent was starting to run out of ability to screen his own backfield. And on turn 4, they move themselves over this way, charged a Landspeeder Vengeance here, and shot off the Tech Marine that was on this objective. So on turn 2, Michael scored a 0. On turn 3, he scored a 5, only holding this objective down here. Turn 4, he scored a 0. Meanwhile, I scored a 10 on every single turn, meaning that I scored 40 primary on hidden supplies, and I don't know if Michael would have gotten a 15 for sure, but as we got towards the end of the game, I told him, hey, look, I'll let you score all of your points, get your 15 at the end, and you can have the 20 primary plus whatever cards you end up drawing on turn 4. And this 20 difference in primary is more than the entire advantage that I had throughout the course of the game. Neither of us were drawing secondaries particularly well this game, but because I was so much better on primary than my opponent, I was able to leverage that difference, and I never really let my opponent leverage his super strong shootbacks. I actually didn't really shoot Dorns at his vehicles unless I was able to pick off isolated units that my opponent was not going to be able to shoot me back at. So I ended up winning this one 73 to 56. And because that's less than 20, this primary difference was the entire difference in my ability to win the game. This game was honestly probably my favorite game of the event. Michael was a really genuine dude, and we had a similar attitude for, tell me what your intent is, and we'll talk about whether or not it's possible, and if it is, we're going to let you do it. So shout out to Michael for being a good opponent. My next opponent was Ivan. He was playing Bully Boys Orks with Gazgul, 1 unit of Tank Busters, 1, 2, 3 War Bosses, 1 unit of Boys, 2 units of 10 Knobs, 1 unit of 5 Knobs, 1 unit of 3 Mega Knobs, 1 unit of Commandos that he split into 2 5s, 2 units of Gretchen, 2 units of 5 Flash Kits, 2 units of 5 Storm Boys, and then 3 trucks. Ivan and I played this one on Linchpin Tipping Point, once again on Layout 1. And this is a game that I think was probably won off of a couple mistakes my opponent made. In general, on Layout 1, a lot of distances between staging for the Orks are generally too far for the Orks to have a really effective wall turn, because you're generally going to have to stage like here and here, because anywhere else you're going to get shot. Because if you like try and put guys here, it's not difficult for there to be a Dorn hanging out here who's going to move past this ruin and shoot. So this staging point and this staging point are the main staging spots that you do have unless you're able to get a good rapid ingress off. But the other part of that is even just having this and this as your staging points, you're putting out a lot of threat because you're going at minimum 6 plus 3d6. In general, I'm fairly comfortable making my opponent roll 3 5s, which means I give them 15 inches, which means I give them 15 inches of respect, right? So if you're standing here and you go 6 plus 15 is 21, which from this rune over here, the 21 is like this. So on your Wa turn, you'll notice that that entirely envelops this objective. And because Bully Boys has 2 Wa turns, and they're oftentimes going to be disembarking from a truck as well, getting an extra 3 inches, that pushes you all the way back to here, a space that you have to consider your opponent could charge you at. So in general, it's very powerful for Orks to have things here, and just kind of sit there waiting with a bat around the corner for your opponent to step too close. So the game for Guard generally becomes, you need to disrupt these staging points really effectively. And just like we were talking about before, by having like a Chimera come out over here, or to put guys here in order to disrupt this, or have your tanks move relatively aggressively, because Orc shooting, even with tank busters and shock attack guns, is not very impressive into Dorns. Guard needs to spend a lot of time putting pressure on the Orcs in order to make sure that they are always on the back foot. But on layout 1, just as those distances are relatively difficult for Orcs to always get to, it's not always easy for Guard to put a ton of pressure on the game. And when I went first, that ended up being a bit of a difficult spot to be in because I had to start putting the pressure on my opponent. Now, because both of us were playing armies that had a lot of models, that had a lot of moving parts, that had a lot of transports, that we had to constantly go back and forth with things, we ended up only getting through 4 battle rounds. However, my opponent definitely left at least 8 points of secondaries on the table that he just didn't score. The first one was on turn 1. I had taken a unit of Kasrkin and Chimera. The Chimera ended up being over here, and I had like the unit of Kasrkin disembark over here. I ended up charging the Chimera into like the last commando that was here in order to try and score a couple of extra no prisoners points. And my opponent had a unit of boys hanging out here and like a unit of storm boys right in here. And he drew area denial, and he undercommitted because when these boys came out, I ended up overwatching a bunch of them to death, which meant that there were not enough boys to actually full kill the Kasrkin unit, and he was not able to get the boys in order to get close enough to the center of the objective, meaning that he did not score area denial. Even just committing these storm boys relatively early on in the game in order to score those 5 points would have been 5 points that Ivan would have had later on in the game. The other thing is that Ivan, on turn 2, just forgot he had recover assets and ended up shooting or charging everything that could have been doing recover for him. So I ended up losing 5 points on area denial and 3 points on recover assets that he just didn't score. The game otherwise was fairly back and forth. I was able to hold this on my home every single turn, so I got 8, 8, 8, whereas my opponent did not hold this one on turn 2 because I was able to take him off of it before a bunch of like knobs and Gazgul standing over here during the wall, so I was just never going to kill that many Mega Knobs. And so my opponent ended up getting a 3, 8, 8. I ended up scoring 26 points on secondary. My opponent ended up scoring 25, but as you can clearly see, these 8 points over here could have been 33 points. And one of the big reasons why I didn't feel comfortable talking it out in this last one, it was really unclear to me without actually playing the turnout whether or not Ivan was going to be able to get the 13 at the end for Linchpin. Because he was definitely going to score this objective down here, but this one in the middle, I was going to go put a lot of OC. I was planning to try and get both Dorns onto that objective on turn 5, and then between an Overwatch, the 10 OC, and just having a lot of other people in and around that objective, it was not obvious to me that Ivan was going to be able to hold it. So at the end, it ended up being a 60-54 win. But if Ivan had simply remembered his 2 secondary objectives, he would have went up to 62 points if he had remembered to do both of his objectives on the right turns. And then, of course, but this was a very close game that I ended up playing up against Ivan, and I ended up going 3-0 on day 1. Now, this is where I want to show you guys something really interesting, because you'll notice that most of these players only played 3 rounds. And at a $50 entrance fee, that's an expensive RTT for most players. One of the issues about this event was that they announced in order to make room for other patrons, in particular I had heard talk of a Magic the Gathering event, they were only going to have the undefeated players play on day 2. There was not a Magic the Gathering event on day 2. In fact, there were 8 to 10 unused Warhammer 40k tables that could have been used, and with only 27 players total, we could have had at least 20 players playing on day 2. But for whatever reason, most players ended up paying a $50 for an RTT, which is a lot. On day 2, there were only 3 other players we needed to worry about. There was an Eldar player playing Aspect Host with the Avatar of Cain. There was an Orc player playing Cult of Speed. And there was a Chaos Space Marines player playing Veterans of the Long War with a list that was very heavily inspired by Liam VSL's London GT. My round 4 ended up going up against Max and his Cult of Speed Orks. He had Boss Snickrot, 2 War Bosses, 2 units of Boys, 2 Trucks, 2 units of Breaka Boys, 3 units of 6 Def Coptas, 2 units of Gretchen, 2 units of 10 Commandos split into 4 units of 5, 1 Shock Jump Dragsta, 1 unit of 3 Warbikers, and 2 units of 6 Warbikers. Max and I ended up playing this one on Scorched Earth Tipping Point on Games Workshop Layout 4, and Games Workshop Layout 4 is not a layout that you see played very often. In many ways, it is Layout 6, but worse. And one of the big reasons why it's worse is this piece is doing nothing. Like, it doesn't matter. Whereas on Layout 6, you have, like, this piece turned a little bit like this. This piece, I think, goes a little bit this way. And then you have this piece coming over here. So you actually have a lot of relatively interesting sight lines on Layout 6 that just are open on Layout 4. That said, this mission was a little bit worrying to me because Orks is really good at primary denial. And being Scorched Earth, every time I don't hold an objective is 5 points I'm probably never getting back. So if Max is able to take units, stop me from holding this one on like turns 2, 3, or 4, and suddenly I'm missing 15 points of primary that I was expecting to have in most matchups, I'm very rapidly looking at a spot where I might not be able to keep up. If I go first, it's a lot easier for me to hold on to my own primary, but because Max ended up putting like commandos, I was still not going to necessarily be in a spot where I could put a ton of pressure on Max throughout the course of the game. And the only reason why this unit of commandos was here is because I won the defender roll-off and put Sly Marbo here in order to protect my scout moves and buy myself a little bit of space on this side of the board. Max ended up going first, and Max, in deployment, I told him this, is that he made a big mistake with the commandos. Because realistically, he doesn't need to have 4 units of commandos in order to do the jail at the beginning. He probably could do it with this unit of commandos and this unit of commandos, or maybe this unit of commandos, but two of the 5 units of commandos. Because he took this one ended up charging Sly Marbo, this one advanced to be like here, this one, I think, charged something, and this one advanced in order to block me over here. But there's a couple issues with this. One, if I go first, this is all dead. And 2, he could have gotten almost the same amount of value with like 1 unit of the units of commandos like here, kind of hidden, and maybe one of the other units of commandos like just hanging out like here, where he still has a couple of assets afterwards. But throughout the course of this game, Max never actually denied me any of my primary. This unit of Death Corps of Krieg ended up making it onto this objective. I think I was able to touch like 1 guy over here. And even though a unit of boys ended up charging into that unit out of a truck that was here on the next turn, between an Overwatch and the Take Cover order, they didn't actually have the attacks necessary to kill all 20 Death Corps of Krieg, and I was able to res guys on here going into turn 2. And then on turn 3, when there was another unit of boys in the exact same spot, I was able to find a spot to get my Gaunt's Ghost, come over here, shoot a couple of boys, and then I got lucky by hitting like an 11-inch charge or a 10-inch charge or something. I think I rolled an 11. I think I needed to roll a 10 in order to tie up that unit of boys, in order to make sure that this unit of Death Corps of Krieg didn't have another layer of threat coming into them on the next turn. That said, because there were like waves of things coming over here, you had like commandos, and then it was like a unit of Warbikers that came next, and then I think it was like another unit of Warbikers. I never actually put any real threat into my opponent's natural expansion. In fact, I didn't deny any primary from my opponent until turn 5, where a unit of Kasrkin, who had come out over here and heroicked into Snickrot, ended up being able to tie him on this objective. But because I was able to get a heroic off with my Krieg, stand over here, get a good Overwatch into the boys as they're trying to set up a charge over here, and also because I hit like a charge with Gaunt's Ghost to make sure that the next wave of boys was not going to be able to get into the Death Corps of Krieg, I was able to hold my primary every single turn of the game. And even though I didn't score secondary super well, I was still able to score my secondaries a little bit better than my opponent and still come out ahead on this one, 84-71. The biggest thing that I would say for people who are trying to understand how this matchup plays is the guard player needs to recognize a couple things. One, a lot of Ork lists cannot kill tanks. Leman Russes and Rogal Dorns, if he shoots like an entire unit of rockets at them from the Defcoptas, are probably going to take 3, maybe 6 damage. And that's if he pops a strat. So the guard player can be kind of a psycho with their tanks, and they also need to be really trying to score primary. You need to give your opponent reasons to bring their units out so you can kill them back and force your opponent to attrition all of these pieces. The 2 turns of brawling with the Death Corps of Krieg over this top objective against commandos and then later boys ended up scoring me at least 10 points. And while I won by more than that, gambling on winning on secondary points is always going to be a little bit iffy. So up against these armies that are a bit more of an infiltrate jail, you do kind of have to be a psycho in terms of pushing forward because they don't tend to do a lot of damage, and you need to score that primary so you don't fall irreparably far behind. If you're interested in watching more of this game, it is available on D6 Tabletop on YouTube and Twitch. I will have links to them down in the description. My last game, I ended up playing up against Jeff and his Veterans of the Log War, because Jeff beat the Eldar player in the other semifinal. Jeff was playing a Chaos Lord with the War Master's Gift, so this is the crit wounds on 5s, Cypher, Fabius Bile, a Disco Lord on Hellstalker, 1 unit of Cultists, 1 unit of 5 Legionaries, 2 Chaos Rhinos, 1 unit of 3 Bikers, 1 Chaos Predator Destructor, 1 unit of 10 Chosen, 2 units of Obliterators, 2 Venom Crawlers, 1 unit of 5 Warp Talons, and then 1 unit of Noise Marines. Jeff and I played this one on Terraform Crucible of Battle. Over lunch, I showed this list to a couple of my friends, and I asked them, how does this list kill a Dorn? And the answer was, they get lucky. There are not a lot of tools in Chaos Space Marines in general that are particularly good at killing Dorns. With only one Predator, only having the 2 las cannons and the auto cannon instead of the extra las cannon, means that it's generally not going to be doing very much damage to a Dorn. And the Chosen Brick, if it gets into the Dorn on the charge, it's got an okay chance of picking it up. But that requires me to be a player that allows him to charge my Rogal Dorns with his Chosen. And on the flip side, everything in Chaos Space Marines just melts to Dorns. The fact that almost all of it has a 3+ save and we have the ability to pump it up with the Exterminator and the Fields of Fire does mean that we are just going to be forcing a ton of saves. And yes, the Chosen are 3 wounds, but a Dorn puts out 2d6 plus 5 double blast number of shots that are damage 3 plus 4 multi-melta shots. Dorns are going to rip Chosen apart. And it's one of the reasons why you don't tend to see Chosen Bricks and Creations of Bile be a little bit more popular, because Possessed and Chosen being at 3 wounds, unfortunately there's a lot of damage 3 out in the meta. My general game plan was very similar to a lot of games I played in the past. Unit of Krieg here, it's going to come stand on this objective. Sly Marbo started like here-ish, with the idea that he could either stand here, be relatively hard to shoot, or he could come out and do objectives on the center objective if you needed to later. Meanwhile, I think it was 2 Chimeras, like, kind of in this pocket, with the idea that I was going to spend one of them at a time to go knock my opponent off of his natural objective. And then Dorn 1, Dorn 2, we're going to play for my objective, and then come out here, deal with the center, and then the Leman Russ Exterminator, which was like here-ish, I want to say, was going to play for this firing line, and then sometimes play for this firing line, depending on what my opponent was doing. Normally on Terraform, going first is pretty good, because if you can set up terraforms on like these buttons and start accruing a lot of primary relatively early on, you generally can spend your actions on the first turn when your opponent isn't showing themselves. You don't have to shoot them at all. You don't have anything to charge, so you can put out some relatively cheap stuff to stand objectives relatively early and start accruing a primary lead. However, for CSM, that wasn't really true, because he needed to value his units a lot higher than I need to value my units as a guard player. That's partly because a Dorn can very reliably kill like 2 units of Space Marines in 1 turn. And I think on turn 1, Jeff gave up way too many assets in order to really play the game. So he had his unit of Warp Talons, I think they started like here, and a unit of Bikers hanging out somewhere in here. 1 unit of Bikers came out to terraform this middle objective, and then the unit of Warp Talons came out in order to do Establish Locus in the center. And then the other side, a Rhino that was here moved and like touched this objective in order to get a terraform going over here. And then I think a Venom Crawler came out over here to like also be on this objective. I think the Rhino advanced, and then I think the Venom Crawler is the one that actually did the terraform. But on my turn, I killed the Warp Talons, I killed the Bikes with a Rogal Dorn, or maybe 2 Rogal Dorns, maybe it took 2 tanks. and a Chimera, which was like staged over here. I took the guys out. They strung out something like this so that I took like, it was like I think it was like a 6-inch charge into the Rhino over this way. And then I hung out all of my good guns over this way and shot the Venom Crawler to death. Then I charged the Rhino, trapping Noise Marines and a 5-man Legionary squad inside the Rhino for a turn. And then I also used a Scout Sentinel here in order to counter terraform here, and then I put a Krieg brick somewhere over here in order to terraform this one. On the next turn, Jeff kind of shoved. He took the unit of Chosen that were in a Rhino that had staged up here, and they end up charging in to, it was like Sly Marbo, and the unit of Krieg was actually stretched out something like this. And he did kill Sly Marbo, and he did pick up the 20 Krieg, but at the end of the fight phase, Jeff had almost all of his Chosen on this side, but there is one Chosen that was not able to get to the other side of the wall. And that meant that the entire unit of Chosen was going to die. Because I had one Dorn that was hanging out over here, that was able to shoot first into the one dude, and then I had my other Dorn come out over here, such that it was relatively close, and shoot into them afterwards. This Dorn even charged into Fabius Bile and left Fabius Bile on 1 wound with a tank shock. And then the rest of the game was kind of like what we were talking about before, where the question becomes, how does a CSM list kill a Dorn? Because with the Dorn standing on this objective and like hanging his butt off of this side so he could see down this lane, and hanging his barrel off of this side so he could see this way, how does a CSM list kill it? And the answer is you spend multiple turns taking your entire army trying to kill it. There's like a unit of 2 Obliterators that were here, a unit of 2 Obliterators that were like here. The Predator that had been spending some time like hanging out back here came out over this way. A Venom Crawler that was here came out and charged it. Fabius Bile actually did like 7 wounds, like 7 damage to the Dorn over a couple of phases of melee. But even though the Predator rolled double sustain on the las cannon shots both times it shot, and the Obliterators were moving up, the Venom Crawler charged it, did a tank shock. I think a Rhino contributed some shots into it. The Dorn took basically Jeff's entire army 2 turns. Meanwhile, I had like units that were coming out here. I dealt with Cypher that was hanging over here. I had another unit of Kasrkin that I rapid ingress like over here to not get charged by Legionaries this way. And then they came out over here and like dealt with Noise Marines. And my opponent just ran out of army so quickly in the game. By the time we got to turn 5, I was just able to do basically whatever I wanted. I'm pretty sure if I was allowed to, I was actually going to score like low 60s in primary. Because I scored 12, 12, 12. Because I scored 12, 12, 16 on the first 3 turns of primary. And then on the last turn, I think I actually got a 12 normally plus 6 on the terraform points, which actually ends up coming out to 58 points of primary that I scored overall this game. I think if Jeff wanted to try and replay this one, I think most single CSM lists are really bad into guard. Like, I think the matchup is close to unwinnable. I think there is opportunities for a Chaos Cult or like AC/DC builds to do well into guard, because you have some silly things that you can do with surge moves, and the AC/DC advancing and charging with potentially bonuses to the distances that they can go does make them have a lot of ability to just like get out there, kill our chaff, and then tag vehicles in combat afterwards. But I think if Jeff wanted to have a chance to win this going first, he could not terraform this, right? The Warp Talons that were here and came out to do Established Locus, and the Bikers that were here that came out to terraform the objective, they can't do that. He needs to be setting up for a bigger go turn on a following turn, and the Warp Talons, especially if you pack for Sustained, have a pretty darn good chance of actually just picking up a unit of Kasrkin. So if he takes like the Disco Lord or the Predator and like, I don't know, kills like a Chimera that is here for some reason, like, you kill the Chimera with shooting between, like, Venom Crawler, Predator, Disco Lord, whatever, and then you have the Warp Talons immediately ready to jump on the Kasrkin that fall out of the Chimera afterwards. Then you can start trading these Warp Talons for multiple units of your opponent's army. You're going to spend a lot of CP on Rapid Ingress in order to set up that play multiple times. But giving the Warp Talons for 2 points, right, like, these Warp Talons were 2 VP on Established Locus, and these bikes didn't actually even score a single VP coming out. They just came out and forced a Scout Sentinel. So these traded for 0 points and ended up getting a Scout Sentinel in return. And like army points isn't everything, but this Scout Sentinel is 55 points, whereas the Chaos Bikers are 70. So this was 70 points of Bikers plus 125 points of Warp Talons for 195 points of army that were traded for 2 VP and a Scout Sent. And I'm sure you can rapidly understand why that is a bad trade. Overall, I ended up winning this one 86 to 53, with probably the largest gap on primary terraform points that I think I've ever seen at 50 to 25, because I just held Jeff to basically no primary in the second half of the game. And with that, overall, I went 5-0, getting my third GT win. I have won 2 GTs at Wizards Keep, and now 1 at Mugu Games, which is my third GT win overall. I ended up getting a lot of store credit, which is probably the best thing about the event, is they actually had pretty good price support. So I ended up getting like $400 worth of new Eldar models, and so I'm very close to having a full Eldar army ready to go. But just like I was mentioning earlier, a lot of the other experiences I had at this event leads to me not wanting to return to the store in the future to defend my championship. Overall, though, if this was still useful for you, if you are enjoying these after action reports, thank you for tuning in. This is the kind of video I was originally planning to do on this channel in the first place, and so they are still fun for me to do anyway. I do have another GT coming up in a couple of weeks, Slaneshmus down in Ocean Shores. So if you are local, come say hi. It's going to be a very strong event. There are a lot of Pacific Northwest top players coming out to this. But thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.